Let's just refresh our motivation of bodhicitta for this afternoon. And we won't do a formal meditation, but at least a short reflection. So again, recall this demon that we're mostly working with in this part of the text, this mind of self-cherishing, this self-centeredness. And just reflect in your own life how operative that is, how much we tend to be very focused on ourselves, maybe even negligent of the needs of others, and how this is creating an obstacle for us. Certainly it causes us to engage in a lot of unskillful behavior, but it also blocks us from having genuine compassion and love for all beings, blocks us from then cultivating bodhicitta, blocks us from becoming fully enlightened for the sake of others. So we're here to use this wise advice of Dharma-Rakshita to overcome that particular demon, as well as the twin demon of self-grasping, but to recognize that this is the work we have to do on the Mahayana path, is to remove these obstacles and cultivate conventional bodhicitta as well as ultimate bodhicitta. So in your heart now, generate that conventional bodhicitta that is the mind aspiring to do this work for the welfare of all sentient beings, to lead each and every one of them to achieving their greatest potential in the state of Buddhahood. Okay, let's go ahead and start then, resume. So, any questions from this morning that are still out there unanswered? We didn't get around to getting the files to people, I'm sorry. I just didn't get back in time to do that. But Amelia has the addresses, so she will send that out later today. Then I will send the files to her, and that can be sent out then to everyone. All right, let's continue with verse 29. Whenever we are afflicted by sleep while practicing the Dharma, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having accumulated obscurations with respect to the holy Dharma. Now we should undergo hardships for the sake of the Dharma. So again, this is another bit of advice in terms of us Dharma practitioners. You know, does this ever happen? You know, fall asleep? Sometimes we're doing our practice so late in the day that we're bound to fall asleep eventually. But this obscurations to the Dharma that we've accumulated, we could say, you know, that there are two levels of Dharma that are frequently taught. One being the scriptural Dharma, the other being the realizational Dharma. Geshe-la in his commentary says that that you can accumulate obscurations in relation to the scriptural Dharma, for example, by walking on Dharma texts and so forth without even the slightest concern, crumpling them, wiping snot on them, and so forth. So this is why one of our refuge precepts is to be very respectful of Dharma texts. You know, as much as possible, anything that represents the Dharma in our lives, to hold it in a more superior position, so on the top shelves of our bookshelves, away from all of the trashy novels or whatever it is that you read. I'm not saying you read trashy novels, but you know, this is just our way of working with the Dharma in our own minds. It doesn't have anything to do with, like, again, the Buddhists aren't going to be offended that we treat the Dharma in this way. It's because we see the Dharma as very precious, very important in our lives. So we try not to, you know, throw Dharma texts on the ground, step over them, step on them, throw them in a backpack with sweaty shoes or something. You know, you try to be as respectful as you can of Dharma, because you see that there's great value to the Dharma. That it has great benefit for ourselves and other beings. So then he says, I also accumulated obscurations in relation to the realized Dharma. This is the other branch of Dharma, what we call the realizational Dharma. And the scriptural Dharma, the texts and all this only exist so we can have the realizational Dharma, so that we can gain the realizations in our own minds of what the Dharma is. So he said we do that by criticizing eminent debaters possessing the qualities of realization and their continua, and criticizing the Sangha. You know, so any way that we've kind of denigrated those who have realizations or the qualities that they possess, then we are essentially in that way accumulated an obscuration with regard to the realizational dharma, the dharma that is, again, the goal to achieve, the scriptural dharma being just the support to help us to do that. So he says, now we should undergo hardships for the sake of the dharma. And this is, again, not just the hardships that we're learning about here, of having to endure our suffering and transmute it and what have you, but it certainly does take, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of effort to complete this path. This is not an easy path to fulfill. But Lama Zopa gave some advice, very wonderful advice. Were you at that retreat, Allison, in Italy in 2004, the Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga retreat? Maybe others were even, but no. It was a wonderful retreat because he taught on Guru devotion so much. It was just really quite special. But I remembered one line that he had, and I went back and listened to it again just to make sure I had the wording right that he had. He said, "Seeking pleasure which results in only suffering, that you should not do. Seeking suffering which results in only happiness, that you should do." So it's kind of interesting. Again, they have different meanings if you look at it. There is a happiness, the pleasure, that will result only in suffering. That's what we tend to engage in, is just going after all these sensory pleasures and fleeting experiences and trying to do whatever we can to be entertained in this pleasure garden of samsara. And this doesn't lead to any real happiness. It only leads to suffering. So seeking pleasure, which results in only suffering, that you should not do. But seeking the suffering, which results in only happiness, by only true happiness, and it's the suffering we have to endure to change our minds, to get this, mind to go in the right direction. Yeah, Radha.
Just did remind me.
Yeah.
Just did remind me this very beautiful verse from Shantideva. I can't remember which chapter it was, but the one where he was, I think from 6th chapter. So yeah, it was like so sentient beings, although they want happiness, they run after the causes of suffering, and all. Plus, if we want, sentient beings want to avoid suffering, but they run after the causes of suffering as they were the best friends. So I just found that verse very.
Yeah, I think I have that verse in the margin of one of these other verses that I'll be reciting. But that's a wonderful verse. Kind of really shows what we're doing. I mean, we're just continually creating our own suffering by chasing after what we think will bring us happiness. Whereas, one teacher told me, he said, if we had put all the effort that we put into getting the pleasures of samsara into dharma, we'd be enlightened eons ago, Instead, we just keep putting energy into samsara, into just like trying to make it better, trying to have a better time, trying to have a little more pleasure. I mean, admittedly, most of us have to have some measure of comfort in our lives to practice the Dharma. We're just not there. We're not like ready to check out and live in a cave and eat nettles. It's just not where we're at. But we do go overboard. We do tend to cling to a lot of this and think that it becomes much more important. So we have to be willing to, as Rinpoche says, seek the suffering which results in only happiness. I sometimes compare the path, and I'm not trying to depress people by using this analogy, but if we look at what we're doing in our minds, we're on a river, there's this current, and we're this boat that's on the river. Our mind is kind of going in that direction. We're trying to first go in the opposite direction, which if you've ever tried to row upstream, you know how difficult that is. Because we've got this mental current that we're following. It's what our minds have been doing since beginningless time. But that's not the end of the job. We have to get the river to go in the opposite direction. So it's a lot of hard work to do that. You have to really work to combat the kind of inertia that's there, the tendency for the mind to just keep moving in the same direction. So this is a challenge. I again, would never advertise Buddhism as the easy path. I don't think that that's my experience. Maybe all of you are having a great time, But we should be having a great time. I don't want to make it sound like it's all, misery and drudgery and toil. I mean, one teacher told me that if you're practicing Dharma and it's not fun, you're doing it wrong. So I think we have to have a kind of lightness and joy and full engagement in all of this and really make it into a very joyful path. But it's a lot of hard work too. So, let me see, there was one bit of advice that I had marked here for page 45. That's okay. I won't share that right now. Again, I think most people know about this idea of treating the Dharma texts in a very skillful way. So I don't know that I need to say much more on that advice either. Okay, we're up to session 5. This is where my session 5 starts, and I'm trying to get through session 8 today. Well, we'll see if I'm going to have any luck. Are we ready for verse 30? Let's read that together. Whenever there is liking for the afflictions and great distraction, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having meditated on impermanence and the shortcomings of cyclic existence. Now we should develop strong repulsion for cyclic existence. So this is one verse that is also on the quiz that I put together for this session 5. Liking for the afflictions, Geshe-la says, is, for example, when seeing the excellent wealth, excellent food and drink, and excellent clothing of others, to like the attachment that thinks, may this definitely happen to me. Similarly, there is liking for anger, as well as for delusion, in the sense that while delusion is mainly considered to be ignorance and so forth, delusion in the world is used to refer to sleep, and there is thorough liking for sleep, due to which there is striving for it. So he's just talking about how we put a lot of effort once more into a lot of mundane concerns, and this is how we spend our lives. The afflictions arise very quickly. We have a lot of distraction in our lives. This is an obstacle for us. This is a problem for us. We see that this is the sharp weapon of actions that we've done in the past coming back to us for having not meditated on impermanence, the shortcomings of cyclic existence, and so on. So again, recall that these are the two main motivations involved in the propelling us onto the small scope or the path for the person of small capacity, and then for the middling capacity, that we really have to get the impermanence of this life and what will happen at the end of this life. That if we don't have that level of concern, we can waste this whole life. We can get very involved in delusion and distraction. But also, if we don't see the greater picture of the shortcomings of samsara, the faults of this cycling from existence to existence. Again, there's many teachings in the Lam Rim on all of this, so I'm not going to spend much time going into it. The various faults of samsara that are set out, the ways that we can see the suffering nature of this existence. So we have to spend a lot of time meditating on those, which of course means, once more, although this is a bodhisattva practice, although this is the great scope, we need to have a good foundation in the small and the middle scope. Otherwise, our minds won't move away from these patterns of the distraction, of the afflictions and the distractions. So we need to develop, as it says there, a strong repulsion for cyclic existence, not just the lower realms, which is the small scope. Motivation is to not want to end up in an unfortunate state, but to see all of the sufferings within samsara, to really understand the various levels of dukkha as the Buddha taught it in the First Noble Truth. Let me just review those really quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but the one level of dukkha, of the 3 levels that are taught in that presentation, that's quite obvious, is what we would call the dukkha of pain. And this is something we all know is something undesirable in our lives. But then there's the dukkha of change, which is the fact that even the pleasant experiences we have are not lasting, they don't ultimately satisfy. And then finally the dukkha that is called pervasive conditioned suffering or dukkha. And that's the reality that every moment of this existence is unsatisfactory because we're under the control of these factors that are propelling us to take another mind and body, leave that behind, take another mind and body. This is the fundamental situation that we're all in that is unsatisfactory. So all of those kinds of meditations support our use of this life quite well. Now, in the small scope, the meditation on death and impermanence, most of you know this 9-round death meditation, death awareness meditation. I won't go into all of that. That's also in the traditional texts, the Lam Rim, Stages of the Path texts. But it's centered around 3 main points. Again, what's the first one? Quiz time. Death is definite. Death is certain. I mean, that may sound kind of silly because if you ask anybody, are you going to die? They'll say, of course I'm going to die. But do you really get that you're going to die? Do you really live from that place that you're going to die? Second one, time of death is uncertain, right? So there's an uncertainty to the timing, although there's a certainty to when it will happen. And this is the big one Lama Tsongkhapa says that we need to spend a lot of time meditating on, because death can happen any day. It can happen this afternoon. You may not make it to tomorrow. We like to think we will, but... Then finally, the third point. At the time of death, that it's only our spiritual practice that will be relevant, important, because all the other things we leave behind. You know, this body, possessions, friends, everything that we've grown quite accustomed to. So anyway, I won't, like I said, spend a lot of time on that. I just wanted to refresh everybody's memory on terms of these main points of the meditations in the small and the middle scope. Let's go on then to verse 31. Whenever, no matter what we do, we fall into decline, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having disregarded actions as well as cause and result. Now we should strive in actions of forbearance and so forth. So Geshe-la says to fall into decline, that first line, the result we're talking about is, for example, to practice the Dharma, but even though one listens to it, thinks about it, studies it, one constantly worsens without improving. And even though one meditates, the same thing happens. You know, so we don't really see our Dharma practice progressing. Now, in any particular period of time, it may be kind of a few steps forward, a few steps back, because, as I said, we're working on changing our minds in pretty drastic ways. So it's not like we're always going to see every day an improvement, every day moving upward, 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 upward. We're going to have, you know, over time, a generally upward orientation. But as this is the case where we see it kind of staying flat or even going into decline, becoming worse, our behavior actually becoming worse. He says, in addition, when this is illustrated with respect to the world, it is that no matter what business, farming, and so forth one does, one only falls into decline. So that's when, once more, all of our even mundane efforts are not so successful. We are unable to move them forward. So when this happens, again, think that this is my own karma ripening, and it's due to, you know, having disregarded actions, karma, causes and results, you know, that we need to create the causes for particular results in our lives, or we never experience them. And he says, you know, without calculating them even slightly, without thinking about what it is we need to do. And this way we haven't adopted virtuous actions. Instead, we've only done non-virtue. And so he says, once more, you would do taking and giving. Think that this is not, you're not alone in this situation. There are other people who are also falling into decline, who have the same problems you are dealing with, both worldly and spiritually. And take on their suffering, you know, give them happiness. And moreover, from now on, we should strive in actions of forbearance, such as readily accepting however many hardships arise while practicing the Dharma. This is a bit, once more, what was in that quote from Rinpoche that we just went through a few verses ago. To endure whatever hardships are necessary because we know it's going to be resulting in ultimate happiness for ourselves and others. You know. And don't disregard the law of cause and effect. You know, I think it's hard to have full confidence in karma. And we see how quickly we are to blame others or to find things at fault in our society when we recognize, if we really recognize karma, we would get right away that it's our own stuff that's ripening. It was interesting when Lama Zopa was asked at the 2016 Light of the Path retreat, this was just before the election in the US. Somebody said, Rinpoche, what do you think of Donald Trump? And Rinpoche said, his very first line, he didn't make any comments about Donald Trump really. He said, America will get the president that America has the karma to get. And he went on to talk about karma and merit and, you know, and how there could be great decline in things because we might not have the merit to have, you know, that experience of whoever, you know, whatever. So this is really, you know, an important thing to keep in mind. We can look at the world around us and we can blame it on a lot of things. You know, these people voted this way and these people did this and all of these various things. Sure, those are conditions that led to that result, but why do we have that result? Because of our karma. So we have to take that ownership and pay attention to creating the causes that we have to create in order to make sure things continue to move forward in the world, continue to be places where we can practice the Dharma and can, help others and so on. Shall we move on? If there's ever any questions, if I get to the end of a verse, just put your hand up, because yes, okay. Adam and then Amelia.
So I have a question that's not directly on this verse, but it's, can I ask it now?
Well, ask it, and I may forego answering it immediately, but okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
So my question is, I think you mentioned that you shouldn't, or I've read it somewhere, that you shouldn't visualize yourself as the Buddha. Like there's a sort of practice where you transfigure and visualize one of the Buddhas as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that you shouldn't do that without initiation.
Right.
So I'm wondering why the initiation is necessary before doing that.
Maybe that's a bit off topic, but again, there is an exception in that Lama Zopa says it is fine to visualize yourself in the form of Shakyamuni Buddha, the Buddha such as in the statue here. There's no problem with that. The other Buddhas where there is kind of a tantric empowerment is just so that you have that empowerment. You have some force of the mind of the Lama imbuing you with the ability to manifest yourself in that form. I mean, I suppose you could do it, it just doesn't have as much power. And so the advice that's usually given is to wait till you have the empowerment, and then with the force of the empowerment, having done that mutual meditation with the Lama in the initiation, that then you have some strength behind it to really make it more effective. Plus they say, and we get into some of the other Tantra teachings, it's really about awakening potentials that we have within us, and this is part of the empowerment as well. So you kind of like haven't activated everything to make that meditation effective. So,
thank you.
Okay. Amelia.
This is about things that happen on nature, like tsunamis and
Sure.
Earthquakes, and
Right.
all of that. Is there a component of karma wherever it's happening
Mm-hmm.
related to the folks who live there, or it's independent, but it's their karma to be there in that place when that happens?
I kind of hear what you're saying, but when we deal with natural disasters or things in the world, we have to say once more, there's the environmental result. We've created this environment. We've created an environment that has earthquakes and tsunamis and all the various fires and volcanoes and all the various things that can cause problems for sentient beings who live in the vicinity of those. There's the karma of the beings who live in the vicinity of those who have created those environmental results. There are even some, though, that live in those areas that if there's a tsunami, they manage just fine, and others who die and are, have all kinds of loss on the basis of that. So we see it's quite complex when you start dealing with those sorts of situations. But in my perspective of the Buddhist teachings and karma, you have to say it's all karma, or else you run into the problem, the dilemma of then there is some level of suffering, some level of dukkha that you cannot remove no matter what you do, because it's not controlled by karma. Therefore, if you remove the causes that feed karma, well then you still have something left over that you have to experience. The third truth would be impossible. You could never have a cessation of suffering because you always have a factor that is outside of the control of sentient beings. So that's the way I look at it in a very broad way. But I know people get into kind of, well, this is happening in nature. His Holiness said once, this is in The Meaning of Life, I think, that book, he said that if a branch on a tree falls to the ground because it's just too heavy and the tree can no longer support it, and there's no sentient beings below it that are injured by that tree, well, then we could say that's cause and effect in nature. But if there's somebody, person, insect, squirrel, whatever, underneath that branch and the branch falls on them, injures them or kills them, then we say that that's karma. It's because it's a sentient being experiencing it. So there's the natural track of the world, but that world is informed by the karma of beings. So it's never an independent thing. That's just on its own, nature doing its thing with no regard to the karma of the beings in it. But I don't know. Good enough? Let's continue on. Let's go to verse 32. Whenever the rites that are performed go awry, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having put our trust in the black side. Now we should turn away from the black side. Sounds like Star Wars. Luke, turn to the dark side. Yeah. So what is the black side? Geshe-la says such actions are, so he says black actions or the black side is putting our trust in people who practice black magic, spirits, and so forth. I think that this is a more traditional view of it. Such actions, he says, are black actions in that they are aimed at our own happiness, wealth, and so forth, which is to say not that we have to have actions where we rely upon people who engage in black magic or something, but it's anything that we do that is about our own comfort and well-being, that is in that kind of more worldly vein, rather than things. Certainly there's nothing wrong with having money in our bank account or having these various things, but why do we want them? Do we want them solely for our own happiness, our own wealth, so that we can live comfortably and so on, or do we want them because they're resources we can use for the benefit of others? So anytime that we've had these, are putting our trust in the black side, meaning this type of behavior, anything that's more worldly concerned, then this is the cause for all of our kind of rituals and things that we engage in, for them to be ineffective, for them to not produce the results that we want. Again, this is traditionally things such as, he says, different rituals and so forth that begin from people beating drums, ringing bells, and so on. Like if you have, oftentimes people are encouraged in this tradition, and I think it's a wonderful practice to have various pujas and rituals done to aid one in particular endeavors, but to always keep that kind of dharma perspective to doing that. Not that we want the worldly results, we want the more powerful results that come from that. But if you're doing that type of thing, you're trying to get the energy behind that, and it's not creating the results that you want, no matter what you do, well then it's because you've put your faith in things that are more worldly and things that are more directed at that level of concern. So when we pick them apart, you can often see how it's opposite thinking. So if we're putting in, all this sort of energy into getting things in our life, but we maybe have the wrong motivation because traditionally we've always held to things on that dark side, the black side, wanting it only to be about our own happiness, our own wealth, our own satisfaction, our own comfort. Well, then we've created that type of karma to make those things ineffective. Even if our motivation might be pure right now, in the past, we haven't really done that in the best possible way. So he says now we should turn away from that. Make sure that all of our activities that are not the Dharma are abandoned and practice the Dharma alone. Which once more, as I said, that means that we have the right motivation for everything that we do. We try to live, as Rinpoche often advises, with bodhicitta mindfulness that I talked about earlier. Let that be your motivation for everything that you do, from, eating a biscuit with tea to sitting down and meditating on Mahamudra. Everything is done with that motivation. All right, let's go forward to 33. Whenever our requests do not reach the three jewels, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having had confidence in Buddhahood. Now we should rely upon the three jewels alone. So as I said, we're still in this section where we're getting a whole lot of stuff that's oriented around our own practice of Dharma. Here it's saying, whenever our requests do not reach the three jewels. Again, maybe just a little bit about prayer and requests in this tradition. When I grew up Catholic, of course, we prayed because we wanted particular things in our lives. We wanted whatever God was going to be able to grant us to materialize in our life. In Buddhism, we can seek the aid of the three jewels as well. It's not that they can't be some support for us, but we have to recognize that it's an interdependent thing, kind of like we were just talking about with karma. There's always our own dimension involved in it. So if we are making strong requests, prayers for success in our practice, in our lives, whatever that we need, we're doing that with the understanding that we can't just sit back and not create the causes for that. We have to create the causes for that, and in conjunction with our aligning ourselves with the three jewels, with the Buddha, with the Dharma, with the Sangha, then we will be creating the right conditions. But until we create the causes for it, there's nothing that the Buddhas can do from their side. The Buddhas completely empowered, but we have none of the conditions to be able to receive that. So Geshe-la said, during desiring excellences such as wealth, status, and so forth for ourselves, but not accomplishing these aims, even though we have made requests for this purpose to the three jewels, is what is meant by the first line. So when this happens, we should not develop a wrong view toward the three jewels, but instead understand that this is the bad actions turning against us of previously lacking confidence in the inner or Buddhist Dharma and the three jewels. Of course, what is the Dharma that we initially are practicing, and it's practiced throughout the entire path? The Dharma of following the law of karma, of cause and effect, of recognizing that we have to create the causes if we are ever to experience the results. So that's when it says confidence in Buddhahood. I mean, it's confidence in all that the Buddha taught, primarily, though, the teachings on karma. He says, so even though we were taught this and that from the Dharma, we did not have confidence in it and thought it is not true that it is like that. Then from now on, whatever happiness or suffering arises, we should not seek another refuge. Instead, through placing our confidence in the three jewels, we should rely on them alone. So again, this is requiring us to have that genuine trust in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, but recognize that that faith and trust is only built through our own experience, our own engagement in the Dharma. This is why faith in Buddhism is not the same as the faith I was taught about in Catholic tradition or many of the other spiritual traditions. It's a bit of a blind faith. It's faith that arises through our own conviction based on our experience with these teachings. That we engage in them and we see the results in our lives, that we are happier people, that we are having things in our lives may not be going completely smooth, but we're able to deal with them in ways that are different. We don't get so bent out of shape. Our mind actually is changing. That's the faith and confidence that we're talking about here, where we recognize that this is our support. I like Alex Berzin's term for refuge. He actually calls it finding safe direction, which I think is for our Western minds has a nicer connotation. Refuge is it's a strange word. We don't use it that much in English to have the same type of meaning. But finding safe direction. We have found unsafe direction through a lot of our lives in a lot of different ways. Things that we thought we could rely upon that let us down because they didn't have the capacity to do that. To really fulfill our deepest aims. But the three jewels have that. So we have to know the three jewels. That's the topic of refuge, once more in the small scope. And then we have to generate our own sense of confidence based on our experience with the Dharma. Okay, let's go on to 34. Whenever the negativities of degeneration rise as polluted demons and evil spirits, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having accumulated negativities with respect to the deities and mantras. Now we should destroy all conceptualizations. So this verse is a little complicated. There's a lot of stuff in this verse. I'll explain it as best as I can. But this first line, negativities of degeneration rise as polluted demons. One translation Thupten Jinpa had for this was veils and evil spirits. I mean, Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in particular, does teach that there are these kind of malevolent beings, forces in the world that do have some impact on us potentially. There are other sentient beings who we have some karma with, something that we've done to them in the past, and now they're in a form as some kind of spirit or hungry ghost, and they're interacting in these malevolent ways with us because of what we've done in the past. But, we don't necessarily need to go beyond our own minds just to see the kind of demons, the maras that we all have within our own minds, our own afflictions. So whenever this is arising in this way, though, where we feel that we've got these kinds of obscurations, the Tibetan term actually for this negativities of degeneration is namtok, which we could also say is kind of obscurations, imagination. It's kind of like different things, kind of the ways that we've degenerated in our mind stream through breaking vows, commitments, things like that. So whenever that sort of energy arises in these negative forces in our lives, as these spirits or these strong delusions and things, this is the sharp weapon of actions for having accumulated negativities with respect to the deities and mantras, as it says here. Deities, Geshe-la says, are presently the non-supramundane deities, the worldly deities, as well as the supramundane deities, the Buddhas who are manifesting in various protector forms and so on, beings that we may have generated some negativities towards. So this is, again, getting into a whole nother explanation, but Buddhism too teaches that there are very beneficial, benevolent forces in the world, who are these deities, certainly the Buddhas themselves, and particularly Buddhas who appear as protectors. And, to have faith in worldly protectors is always a bit iffy. My teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso in Italy, always told this story about was this man who had a goiter, a really bad goiter on his neck, and he went down by this, walking across this river, and this demon appeared and, asked for something from the man, like, give me your body or whatever, and he said, here, I'll give you this, and the demon ate the goiter, and so he was able to get rid of the goiter. Well, he told his friend who had a goiter about this. And his friend went down hoping the demon would eat his goiter, but the problem was the demon didn't like the first goiter. It was rather untasty. And so he gave that first one to the man, so he ended up with 2 goiters. So this is the example. Tibetan stories are always a little weird, but this is the example of putting your faith in a worldly being, that somehow you think they're going to pull through for you, but they don't really always. And again, they're just stories. I think they're just meant to be examples of that type of idea. But we have to be kind of respecting these benevolent forces in our lives. Certainly the Buddhas, who even when they're manifesting as protectors, such as Mahakala, what's the name of Palden Lamo, the protector that's often affiliated around Tibet and the issues in Tibetan Buddhism. Many different of these that are said to be supramundane beings. They're Buddhas manifesting in this form as a wrathful protector to help us on our path. So we need to be very careful about this and make sure that we're according the kind of respect and positive actions in relation to these. When it says the mantras in this context are not to be taken to be merely the usual mantras, Geshe-la says. The etymology of mantra is that it is that which acts to protect the mind. This is what mantra means. A mantra is mind protection. It's not the syllables that we often will refer to, though we will call that a mantra. The concept is that which protects the mind. Therefore, all the dharma that protects the mind from the side of non-virtue can be posited as the mantras of this context. So we think this is the ripening of my having been not in accord with my own actions, but rather accumulated, or my own intentions, but rather accumulated these negative actions in relation to these benevolent forces in the world, as well as the Dharma itself, as well as anything that is there to protect my mind, but I haven't really honored that. So now we should destroy all of these kinds of negativities of degeneration, misconceptualizations, conceptual constructions, any of the ways that we've created our own obscurations around this by having had these faulty thoughts and negative behavior towards these. So yeah, Geshe-la talks a lot about these spirits and different types of spirits. In Tibetan Buddhism, we even sometimes do talk about spirit harm, where somebody gets to the point where they're receiving an awful lot of influence in an unfavorable way from these beings. But once more, it's a karmic creation, and there are going to be manifestations of that some people will have to deal with because they've created the causes for that. So Geshe-la, and his advice from this whole thing was, we need to strive to develop a good heart filled with love, compassion, and bodhicitta, as well as the mind of renunciation and the realization of emptiness. This is really what we need to do, rather than, treating any of this with any sort of disdain, any negativity, just to really continue to have a good heart. I don't know if I can say really much more on that. There's a lot of practices in Tibetan Buddhism that are about appeasing some of these forces in the world, doing incense pujas and all of this. I don't know. It was interesting when Rasna was in the Kopang course that I taught, and when Lama Zopa arrived, we thought, he'd be teaching within a day or two, and he instead had to do this puja because there were some forces, something going on in the grounds at Kopan that needed to be removed, some obscurations that we'd created or something. So it was really quite special to see him out there doing that. I mean, it's just genuine concern for making sure that the course was successful and all of that. Yeah, and a microphone, yeah.
One of my teachers told me that I think it's the land of Tibet itself, like before Tibetan Buddhism came there, it was the person who brought that to the area from before, when there was Mongol population. There were spirits there, or demons, two demons, and this enlightened being sort of overpowered them and made them become the protectors of the land. He said that now you're
Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, yeah. So we see again that there's nothing again absolute or inherent about any of this. That something that is actually quite malevolent can become benevolent through the force of shifting that karma, changing things. I mean, it's kind of a nice story in that way, because we can see that, again, we can use anything. It's a bit like what this whole text is about, transmuting something that appears kind of opposed to our well-being into something that actually helps us. So it's another different story of transmutation. But were you going to say more on that?
Well, I have another story of transmutation, that there was a monk who, I think, he created a demon, and then he went and ran to his master and was like, Master, there's a demon in the garden. And he's like trembling, and the master comes out and just gives the demon a big hug and kind of absorbs it. And it's another example of transmutation.
Yeah, I mean, often when we have these kinds of forces, again, most of the ceremonies that are done, the rituals, are around offering them something, because they want something. That's why they're there. There's this kind of drive for them to come to you because of something you've done that has shorted them in some way, given them reason to come after you. They want something. So, you have to have that benevolent mind that wants to benefit them, that gives them what they need. Not the mind that gets all upset that they're there and tries to force them out or something. Kind of invite them in. Make them a cup of tea. Okay. Yes.
What does this...
Wait 1 second. Abelardo, yeah.
Specifically here, what is referred to as conceptualizations?
Yeah, I mean, conceptualizations is it's the same term, I think, as namdak that was used earlier. It's just all of our kind of, let me read from Good Karma, because I think I liked what Thupten Chodron had to say about it, but because it's not in Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary, I sometimes don't bring all of these additional things in, but let me go to Good Karma is here. And this is something I bookmarked, so it should come up. In Geshe-la's commentary, he simply says all the bad conceptualizations discordant to the Dharma, all the ways that we've had thoughts that are not in accord with the Dharma. But I think in Good Karma, Thupten Chodron says something more about all of this. So if you're patient just 1 minute, I'll get that up here. Okay, come on, Kindle. These devices are great when they work, but when they take forever... Come on. It was page 86, okay. She says, this verse points out that our misconceptions are ultimately responsible for such difficulties. Imagination, or namtak in Tibetan, refers to misconceptions, preconceptions, false assumptions, fabricated stories and beliefs that our minds create. Some of these, such as the 4 distorted conceptions, which is what Rinpoche frequently teaches on, that we see what is impermanent as permanent, that we see what is in the nature of suffering as happiness, that we see what is impure as pure, that we see what is selfless as having a self. These 4 misconceptions are one of the main ones, but it's like any of the mistaken interpretations that we have of things, our false projections, kind of all of this. And so this is what was kind of appearing, this is due to that appearing in our lives, manifesting in the form of these malevolent forces. So then we have to get rid of the misconceptions that are behind them. You know, our false ideas, false ways of thinking. She says, while meditating, the great Tibetan yogi Milarepa was disturbed by spirits. He questioned them, "Why are you bothering me?" They replied, "Your Namtak invited us to come." In other words, these spirits were created by his misconceptions or invoked by them. So if we get rid of their cause, then we won't have that kind of force in our lives, these mistaken ideas. Does that
yes,
give some...
because there is, I was thinking that because it refers to deities and mantra,
Yeah.
one of the requirements is not to have many superstitions, because otherwise you create false concepts around your experiences,
Exactly,
and then
yeah.
you end up creating all these obstacles. So I don't know if that was also.
I think that could be
referring to
related to that. Sure, I think so. Yeah. Let's go on to 35. Whenever we wander powerlessly in a foreign place, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having evicted lamas and others from their dwellings. Now we should no longer banish anyone from any place. So again, this is pretty obvious on this one. If we are sort of at the mercy of whatever forces in our abode, wherever it is that we're living, it says there in a foreign place, but it could be anywhere where we aren't feeling like things are in place for us in terms of a home, where we are, as I said, sort of under the control of other factors. That's from having kind of taken people out of their home settings, out of settings that are comfortable for them, evicted lamas and others from their dwellings. So he says this is retribution for in previous births when we had very great power, evicting even our own lama and others and not allowing them to reside in their dwellings. So, His Holiness in an oral commentary that I've listened to, where he talks about this text, he says that Milarepa actually in the early part of his life when he first started to practice the Dharma, he was often expelled from initiations and teachings with Marpa, that Marpa would get out of here, This is kind of that sort of karma where you haven't created the causes because you haven't treated others respectfully to be able to be in a place, to be sort of abiding there. So he says, now we should no longer banish anyone from any place. So from now on, you shouldn't banish any person from their dwelling. Try to be as respectful as you can about others and in their place of safety, security. And then do taking and giving again, which is the advice on all of these. So any comments on that? Let's go on to 36. I'm going to do probably an abbreviated commentary on a lot of these unless they're on the quiz. Whenever the unwanted, such as frost, hail, and so on, occurs, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having properly guarded our pledges and morality. Now we should keep our pledges and the like pure. So we saw a similar, bit of advice earlier on around pledges and commitments. This is an interesting one. It's kind of being related to environmental karma, similar to what we were talking about when you have all these kinds of things happening. But this is mentioning particular things that would get in the way of having a good harvest. Where you have frost happening at a time where then the fruit trees don't blossom fully and don't produce their fruit. You can't really get what you want out of those endeavors. And I think we could apply this not just to, if you're a farmer, but rather any of us who are just trying to make a living, trying to have things go somewhat our way so we have the resources that we need. But this environmental result, Tupten Chodron says, is the external manifestation of an internal process of us having had this turning away from the pledges and commitments that we've made, having degenerated those pledges with respect to our lamas, not properly guarding our morality, our actions, abiding by the law of karma and so on. And so this internal process of moving away from pure morality, protecting our vows and so on, is now manifesting in an environment that is hostile, that's not creating the causes for our success. So the advice, again, being given is to, definitely do what we can to uphold our vows, our pledges. And of course, Geshe-la reminds us about Tonglen. He even says we should set aside a little time each day in which to do the taking and giving meditation. Every one of us, no doubt, has some practice of bodhicitta every day. And so, do that as part of generating your motivation. Just incorporate a little bit of Tonglen into it. To Radha. Yes, Radha.
Just very quickly about Tonglen. Should we jump to Tonglen if we are not, for example, grounded enough in loving kindness and compassion practices? Or could that be just actually practice? I don't know, it could be someone who is coming and just love the practice. Would that be okay to jump and actually start developing?
Again, there's no universal answer to these things because every practitioner is different. And it's always hard to say, even though somebody might not in this life have had training in kindness, loving kindness, compassion, they might come into this life with incredible levels of compassion and loving kindness. So I would say that for most of us, though, there's probably some use. These two techniques, I usually teach them, the sevenfold cause and effect first, and then equalizing and exchanging self and others, because I think equalizing and exchanging self and others, that includes Tonglen, is a more difficult practice for most people. But that having been said, there might be people who right from the beginning really warm up to Tonglen and immediately feel totally compelled to do that. But if you practice the sevenfold cause and effect, then you get some more instruction in how to generate loving kindness and compassion. That is what you're trying to make manifest in that visualization and that. So I think it can be useful. Sometimes when I do a Tonglen practice, I didn't do that quite as much this morning, but is to spend a few minutes before you even begin the taking by meditating on compassion, thinking about the suffering of that being, even generating the different levels to think, how wonderful it would be if this being was free from suffering. May they be free from suffering. I myself will do that for them, and then feeding that into the Tonglen. There's nothing wrong with kind of having a mini meditation on both compassion and loving kindness before you do the actual Tonglen. Okay, good. Let's read, we have 37 now, 37. Whenever we desirous ones are bereft of wealth, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having given and not having made offerings to the three jewels. Now we should put effort into actions of offering and giving. So this is a very common, whenever the example for karma, I even did this earlier myself, frequently we talk about resources and generosity. And this is one of the most obvious ways that karma manifests, that if we don't have wealth in our lives, if we have difficulty keeping money in our bank account, everything is always disappearing, then we haven't created the causes by being generous. Generosity is what gives us resources. This is why it's the first of the 6 perfections, is because bodhisattvas need resources, not so they can have cushy homes and wonderful things in their life, but so that they can benefit others. There's one story I like to tell around generosity. There was a nun named Venerable Kathy Losong. She's not ordained anymore, I don't believe. She worked for Venerable Rabina in the Liberation Prison Project office for a number of years. And my partner Patrick worked in the office in Taos in FPMT office that was there from 2000 till 2006 when they moved to Portland. And he would feel sorry for Venerable Kathy at times because she never seemed to have any money in her life, and it was just always not having the things that she needed. So he would give her some money, and then he'd be shocked that she'd be turning around and giving it to Liberation Prison Project to get some more books for the prisoners or do whatever they needed to do. But this is really what we're meant to do with money. I mean, when money comes to us, we're like a conduit to get it somewhere else, to just practice that circle of generosity. And sure, we have to eat, we have to pay our rent, we have to do whatever it is that we do. But, to recognize that kind of breaking that energy of that creates an obstacle. It's like the dam is there then, it doesn't flow. You're not having that outflow of resources, so the water stops coming in on your end because you've put a dam there. So I don't know, it's a really important teaching. But this is something I think we all know from our teachings on karma, that we have to give, to make offerings to the three jewels, to do whatever we can to kind of create that energy. And even if you feel like, well, the problem is I don't have anything, well then you Tibetan Buddhism is great. When you don't have it, just visualize. So and have that intention. Recall that giving is not just the act of giving, of taking something out of your wallet and handing it to somebody else, or protecting them in some way through your resources, but giving is the intention to give. So, the practice of taking and giving has giving involved in it. So really practice that generous spirit of giving everything that you have. Happily giving it away. Even if you don't have it physically to give, you can still give in your own mind. So this is just, I think, a pretty obvious verse in terms of, those of us, it says desirous ones, but, the idea is that we ourselves, we do need resources in our lives. We need things to go in a way that will help us to make sure that we can maintain good health, that we can continue to practice the Dharma, be a benefit to others. But if we don't have that, then it's because we haven't been doing the causes for that, the generosity. So we have to put effort into actions of giving and offering. I think that when Kadampa Lama said that you begin your practice of giving by just giving one thing from one hand to the other. Like, oh, here. Oh, thank you. Oh, here. It really sounds silly. Maybe like you teach a child to start generosity that way. But we have to start wherever we are. That's why, again, water bowl offerings are a very important practice. Water is getting to be a more precious commodity than it was at times in our existence, but it's still a relatively easy thing for us to give, for us to part with, to offer water bowls on our altar to the three jewels. And then, again, you can use that water for watering plants, gardens, what have you. It doesn't have to go down the drain or anything. In fact, it should be something respectful should be done with it. But it's a very easy practice to accumulate that merit of generosity. So, this is where Geshe-la shared this quote from Geshe Ben Kongyal. I don't know if many of you know of Geshe Ben Kongyal. He was this Kadampa Geshe who is really kind of crazy. He had all these interesting ways of talking about things, but he's known to have said, in my youth, when I killed others and stole from them, it was difficult for my mouth to find food. That he hadn't created the causes because he was always taking from others, stealing. He was renowned as having been a very a professional thief. This was what he did with his life up to the point where he met the Dharma. And he says, but now that I have given up these negative actions and I'm trying to meditate, the food can no longer find my mouth. The food doesn't have a home because there's already food in his mouth. The food is coming from all over. But yeah, Geshe Ben Kongyal was interesting. I'll share one other story about him where some of you may have heard some of these, but he was in a gathering of monks and that, and of course most of you know that the monks are set out as well as the nuns in terms of seniority. So there's all these monks that have been ordained longer than him, and so he's way in the third or fourth row or something, and they're coming around with the food to give to every month. All the monks were receiving yogurt or something, and he had his bowl there, and he kept watching to see, was there going to be enough yogurt when it got to him? And then he caught himself what he was doing, how much he was being driven by his self-cherishing mind. And when the man came, finally the monk came with the yogurt, he turned his bowl over and he said, no yogurt for this monk, he's already had his fill. Because he was always thinking about, the yogurt he was going to eat. So he was really good at spelling out, being very clear about his own faults. Another one, having been a thief, he was at the home of some people, and they left him alone in the kitchen, and there was a bag of barley. Barley's a big thing in Tibet, right? The sampa and all of that. And he starts putting his hand in to take some of the barley to steal it. And then he grabs his hand with the other hand and he goes, stop, thief! And the people come in and they go, where's the thief? And he goes, right here, I caught him. So he's kind of a crazy guy. But I love him. I don't know. I wish there was more about him. And there's only 3 or 4 stories about Geshe Ben Kongyal. Let's go to 38. Whenever those around us deride our ugly body, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having made ugly images and burning them out of anger. Now we should construct deity images and have a tolerant nature. So, again, this is, it says deride our ugly body. They do say that one of the real positive things to have in life is a more attractive form, as well as a lot of other qualities. That's why patience is actually said to be one of the causes, just like generosity was the causes of resources, patience is the cause of having a more attractive body, face, what have you. I mean, it's not to say that, again, we get attached to these things, having, good things in our lives, whether they be in our bodies or the resources that we possess, but we recognize there's a value to that. There's some value in, the attraction that other people will have to people who look good, who have a pleasing appearance, and so on. It's not, again, that we're trying to create some sort of false view of what is the ideal way to look or anything. It's just to say that we should have a pleasing presence with others in whatever way. So if we're getting that kind of derision on the basis of, not having created the cause for that, having, not having created a fine body, a body that is the fruition of that type of karma, well then it's the sharp weapon of actions for having made unattractive images, for having, created Buddha images or other holy objects that were faulty, that were not, done in a pure way, and then burning them out of anger. Now, of course, our advice in the refuge commitments, as many of you know, is to not make those kinds of quality judgments on the basis of any holy object. So if we see a Buddha statue that a kid put together out of clay, and the figure's all weird, and the face is sort of strange, and everything's like out of proportion, you don't sit there and go, oh, that's an ugly Buddha. You say, oh, what a beautiful Buddha, because it's a representation of the Buddha, of something that is a perfect being. So you don't get into that kind of qualitative thing. But nonetheless, in the world, there will be things that are considered more attractive and less attractive. So we should try not to create images that are not in line with a pure view of things, to not burn them, to not do things that are damaging to them. Rather, to create beautiful works, beautiful images, construct deity images that are kind of in line with that. And ourselves have a tolerant nature. This is, again, the additional advice that I said is related to the practice of patience. That if we engage in patience, we actually develop a more attractive form. It's another way to help us when we see like all these beautiful people in the world who have amazing good fortune with their looks, to think good about them, rather than sometimes you can feel like some envy or maybe even resentment that they have those beautiful looks, is to really rejoice that they must have practiced patience very well. They must have developed these amazing qualities. Let me look at what else Geshe-la says. He says a lot on this. He says, also burning with anger that is motivated by anger at Buddha images, Dharma texts, and so forth, I lacked respect for them, and burning with the fire of anger, I said, burn them, or else I directly set representations of the exalted body, speech, and mind on fire. Now it is interesting, we sometimes talk about burning Dharma texts that need to be, if we've made photocopies of things that need to be discarded rather than throwing them in the trash, that we burn them. But you don't burn them with anger. You burn them actually with a desire that they still be of benefit, and recite mantra and visualize that the smoke from the fire, goes out in all directions, benefits others. So you don't really do it with the same type of mindset at all. So it's not that burning Dharma is in and of itself the fault, but burning it with anger. All right, next one is also on my quiz, number 39. Whatever we do, attachment and hatred arise in us. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having hardened our intractable and negative continuum. Now we should rid ourselves completely of this rigidity. So I think it was Geshe Sopa in his text described this as, the obstinate self-cherishing attitude. This is why we have this, is that we just have this hardened mind that is totally guided by self-cherishing. That is the reason why we frequently have attachment and hatred arising in us, no matter what we do. And all of us have these, to some degree, I'm assuming. I don't know your mind, so I can't say for sure, but I know when these arise in my mind that these are something we have to contend with, and we see that they're from our own hardened mindset of cherishing ourselves, following our own desires, not being concerned about the welfare of others. So now we have to rid ourselves completely of that rigidity, that obstinate self-cherishing attitude that acts to harden our continuum, that makes us kind of set in this way of behaving. So this one is a bit more general in some ways, It's not as specific to an individual experience, but we can see all of our delusions are driven, as we said earlier, by that self-cherishing mind together with the mind of self-grasping, which again we'll address towards the end of the course when we look at the antidote to that. Geshe-la says, if we ask ourselves, who is that, or who is it that has hardened our mind and caused it to remain unsubdued, we will find that it is our self-cherishing. So let's go on to, we're in session 6 now, just so you know, we're moving along. Verse 40. Whenever, whatever we practice, we do not reach our objective. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having assimilated an inferior view. Now, whatever we do should be done for others' welfare. So we're getting into a bit of repetition with some of the same ideas. You know, and this time it's we practice, but we don't reach our objective. We don't really, you know, Geshe-la uses examples such as meditating on the generation and completion stages of highest yoga tantra, which, you know, it's kind of hard to make attainments in that regard, but nonetheless, you know, whatever spiritual thing we're trying to accomplish, whatever element of the path we're practicing, if we're not reaching our objective, it's because we've assimilated somewhere along the way an inferior view, a wrong view, not something that is in line with what the Dharma is supported by. So Geshe-la says it's because in this life and in previous rebirths we assimilated an inferior view. With respect to views in general, while there are in fact many views that are supramundane and mundane, the view in this context is the inferior view that neglects others through viewing oneself as dear. So it's a very similar, we're still kind of continually going back to this theme of self-cherishing. That the view that we have that I am most important, which as I said is pretty innate within us, are just getting up every day and our first thoughts are always about what do I need, you know, that cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is that we're immediately thinking about self-concern and what I need, you know. And we do that throughout our day. And this is that inferior view in particular that is being singled out here. But obviously there are many different wrong views or inferior views, even holding a view that doesn't accord with the teachings on karma, where we deny karma or think that, you know, things are arising, results that we have are not due to, you know, causes we've created. That would be an inferior view. But here in particular, self-cherishing. So this is what that's coming from. We do taking and giving, Tonglen, for, you know, all the other beings who are like us, who are experiencing the same sort of obstacles in achieving their spiritual objectives. And we think from now on, whatever we do, we follow the path of virtue, we engage in those virtuous deeds with the intent of benefiting others, to go against that inferior view of self-cherishing, you know, to get out of this, as Geshe-la says, entanglement of selfishness. You know, in terms of this view of cherishing others, I like the way His Holiness presents this, and many of you have heard this before, but for those of you who haven't, he says that cherishing others is actually how you are wisely selfish. You know, because if we follow what these teachings are saying, they say that if you engage in the positive actions towards others that are benefited by their welfare, you are the recipient of the good effects of that. So if your selfish mind is telling you want to be happy and not suffer, well, how do you do that? By cherishing others. So the real way to be selfish is to be wisely selfish, to care for others, and in that way you are cared for. So again, this is something I like the way His Holiness puts that, because sometimes we react strongly to these words of, you know, cherishing others or not cherishing ourselves. It's still taking care of ourselves, but taking care of ourselves in the way that actually leads to what it is that we seek. So our main mind should be to benefit others, and then we will be taken care of along the way. This is the next one that's on a quiz, verse 41. Whenever, whatever virtuous practices we do, our continuum remains unsubdued. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having given priority to the grandeur of this life. Now we should concentrate on the desire for liberation. So this one makes a lot of sense too, right? You know, we think that we're doing all these amazing virtuous practices and we're doing our prostrations and our mantra recitations and all these various things, but our minds are still not moving in the right direction. They're still obstinate. Well, this is because we haven't given priority to Dharma in the way that we really mean Dharma. Instead, we've gotten totally caught up in the attachment to this life and what are called the 8 worldly concerns. So I mentioned some of this earlier. The attachment to reputation is one of them, and our attachment to not having a bad reputation is another. These are in pairs. Our attachment to having material gain, material things in our lives, and our attachment to not losing them, those are another pair. Our attachment to having comfort in our lives, the big one, and our attachment to not having discomfort. This is a huge one. I think I can share this. Venerable Rabina said this is the one that she gets so stuck on. It's a big one. We live for comfort in our lives. I always point out how if you have a single traveler, I think of this a lot now because I'm getting on planes constantly, but if you have a single traveler, they never in advance reserve the middle seat, right? In an aisle. Like there's an aisle and a window. You never reserve the middle seat if you're traveling alone.
I don't.
You don't? Okay, good. I thought you were going to say, yes, you do. I've never found anybody who says, yes, I do that. If you're a couple or 3 people or something traveling, then sure, one person ends up in the middle, and it's not a problem because you're hanging out with the people. But it's so uncomfortable in many ways to be in the middle seat with the 2 people there. You don't know them, you're kind of crammed into this little space. So why do we do that? It's just a real obvious way that the self-cherishing mind is kind of, and saying, I want something that's going to be comfortable for me. I'm attached to that comfort of the aisle seat or the window seat or whatever it is that we prefer. We don't like the discomfort. So again, this is the way self-cherishing manifests in our attachment to the pleasures of this life. That's the other pair, comfort and discomfort. The final one is, kind of praise and blame, praise and criticism. We have a strong attachment to other people praising us, giving us lots of good words about who we are or what we do, and then we have a strong resentment, this strong attachment to not hearing words that are critical. We don't want to hear those at all. So this is how we've lived our lives, lifetime after lifetime, as we've given priority to the things of this life. In fact, when Drom Tompa, you know the story, I think, of Drom Tompa, a disciple of his was like reading texts or reciting texts or something, and Drom Tompa said, it's good to recite texts, but it's better to practice Dharma. And so he thinks, well, what does that mean? So maybe I should circumambulate stupas. So he starts circumambulating, and Drom Tompa says, it's good to circumambulate stupas, but it's better to practice Dharma. And then he does like a third thing, reciting mantras or something, and he says, it's good to recite mantras, but it's better to practice Dharma. So the guy goes, what do you mean, practice Dharma? And he says, give up your attachment to this life. That's Dharma. That's where Dharma starts, they say. If you are engaging in any type of virtuous activity and you don't have a desire at least for your future rebirth, at least to put the energy into getting a good rebirth beyond this life, then it's not Dharma practice technically. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and I think it's the Door to Satisfaction, he said he realized after coming across these teachings when he was, I don't know how many years old, that he hadn't been practicing Dharma at all. This is what he says in the book. But I think we can have that sort of aha moment ourselves where we kind of recognize that a lot of what we've been doing, even though we put on the airs of it being Dharma, hasn't really been true Dharma, because we still get quite attached to all of these kinds of worldly pleasures and think that we need that to be there. We need that to kind of be a product of our practice, or we're not going to put ourselves into it completely. So it is important that we practice being with all of this stuff. This is another value of these types of verses. They're giving us the advice to be with discomfort, to be with not getting things the way we want, to be with material loss and with all kinds of other unpleasurable things, and be okay with it, and even embrace it, as I said from this morning, and what Rinpoche says, to even like it, to want it in our lives, to welcome it in. So if we've been giving priority to the grandeur, the pleasant things of this life, then we have to do the opposite. We have to concentrate on our desire for liberation, at least our desire for a good rebirth. That's the small scope. But liberation, enlightenment, to move beyond just this worldly concern. Venerable Tipton Chodron in Good Karma, she says, if you are in prison and want to get out, you don't worry about dust in your prison cell because you're focused on how to escape. This is a nice way to look at it. Why would we put all this energy into kind of having a nice, tidy beautiful prison cell. You know, the prison cell is a prison cell. We're stuck in it. So we should be wanting to get out of the prison cell, not putting our energy into making it a nicer prison cell. Right? I know it's hard. These are hard teachings to hear because we like having a comfortable life, having a... Yeah. So any comments on that one or anything up to this point? Yes. Radhik.
Yeah, I was just thinking how to find this balance, because I guess we wanting to escape, from the prison cell, be liberated, and obviously not wanting to kind of follow after the attachments and the pleasures of this life. We also, I guess, we don't want to completely dismiss those, isn't it? Because then we just go follow to another extreme. So, am I right? I don't know.
Well, I think it is a middle way approach. I mean, the Buddha himself, in the life story of Prince Siddhartha, exemplified how you can't go to either extreme of self-indulgence or self-mortification. But it doesn't mean that then we totally shun anything that challenges us, like, oh, I won't do a nyungne because that's too much suffering, or, I won't do prostrations because it's just too uncomfortable, or we try to do what we can to find a middle way for ourselves, which is not becoming really cushy in our practice, but also not forcing ourselves into such discomfort that it's not productive, Because that was what Prince Siddhartha learned, and leaving behind the beautiful life in the palace, to go to an extreme of asceticism where we're denying even just the physical comfort of this body is not the path either. So I think we have to take that as an example, apply it to our lives as best as we can within our own assessment. But the biggest problem, again, when we go back to the 8 worldly dharmas, I didn't mention this when I went through them, the problems are not the things that are the objects, the material gain or material loss, the praise or the blame, the problem is our attachment to them, And that's a tricky one, because sometimes when people just start practicing, you say, well, you can keep all those things, just don't get attached to them. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? How do I have all these beautiful things that I enjoy in my life and don't have attachment to them? You're kind of like telling them the impossible. So I think we have to really just dissect it. This is why attachment is one of the hardest things to identify and to really extract from the pleasure that we experience. The pleasure isn't the problem. As Lama Yeshe says, Venerable Rabbeinu quotes him, the more pleasure, the better, dear. Pleasure is not the problem. It's our relationship to it, our faulty thinking that it's the be-all and end-all, and embracing it and elevating it, exaggerating it, and then grasping at it and not wanting to be parted from it. That's all the mind of attachment. We have to be able to extricate that, identify that. Yeah, Anda.
I think that all these things that are advised here, if you do it for the sake of liberation with a mind of renunciation, as you said, with selfishness, it automatically helps current life as well. I don't see any that doesn't really help current life, because the issue with current life, as you're saying, attachment and expectations. If you have high expectations, then they cannot be ever satisfied, and that's the issue.
Sure.
So if we at least for me, if we just turn it into that, the whole practice becomes a lot easier. For example, when I was in retreat, Abad Gashacharni in Kopan told me that stop having any expectations from the retreat and you will have a fine retreat. Because as soon as I begin developing expectations that after this retreat I will have this or that, it will ruin the whole thing. But as soon as we stop having these expectations from this practice or that practice, making the longer term view, it automatically helps current life as well.
Yeah. I agree.
That's how I'd say.
I agree, and that's why I do think a lot of people, when they come to the Dharma, might feel some disappointment because they actually might see their lives getting worse than getting better, because the expectation is once I start on this spiritual path, everything's going to be hunky-dory. It's all going to be great, rainbows and unicorns and whatever, So. No, we start seeing all of our garbage, and all of our garbage starts manifesting in the form of obstacles, and everything starts going wrong, and relationships go bad, and then everyone's like, Venerable Robina, congratulations, and you're like, what are you talking about? My life's getting worse. Well, no, your life is getting better. You're just, all the stuff has to come out. It's just like if you have an infected sore, all of the garbage needs to come out before the healing can happen. So, yeah, I think to not have any expectations, not expect the bad stuff or the good stuff. Be okay with whatever arises. We just do the practice. We have this phrase, I guess it may have even come from Britain, who knows practice makes perfect, this phrase. It's kind of not a good way to live your life. Because one student I had said in her experience, practice makes practice. And I think that's a better way to look at it. That there's always just another layer of practice. We practice and then something else becomes evident about what we need to practice on. And then that becomes evident of another level of practice. Don't set ourselves up for this kind of expectation that somehow our lives are going to get perfect or that we're going to get perfect. Yes, the goal in Buddhahood is to achieve a sort of perfected state of our being. But to have an unrealistic expectation around that is not so wise, even to have any expectation, I think. We just do the work. We just keep investing and have that long-term view, like you said, acknowledging that it's going to take as long as it's going to take. Yes, we want to become enlightened quickly for the benefit of others. This is that tantric motivation in particular, because we see it's unbearable that beings are suffering because we're not enlightened. But everything in its own time. We have to create the causes and conditions for it. Yeah, Tony.
The area where most people really struggle with attachment is in the area of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it is the most positive relationship, just the desire to form relationships, that there's some level of attachment in there.
Sure.
And for people who are ordained,
Mm-hmm.
of course they remove themselves from that situation. And I think in my observation, people who are ordained tend to be emotionally very self-contained.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably have a low sex drive as well, which I think must help.
We'd have to ask them, I guess. No, anyway, yes.
Yeah. So the whole process of non-attachment that is put forward or is presented, yes, working through all the negative levels of attachment is understandable, but if we start to really examine all our desires and needs for relationship, or whatever levels they are within our lives, then it becomes a much more complex issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if I can say much more than that, because I think it's very true, everything you've said, Tony. And attachment, they say, of course, again, is the hardest one to really work on. It's very easy to move away from anger, in my estimation. I mean, I've got anger in my mind, certainly. I've had angry incidents in my life that I'm quite embarrassed to even think about. But it doesn't feel good to be angry. It's kind of easy to identify that this is not something desirable for our minds. But attachment, it's all about the pleasurable stuff, the good stuff, right? It seems like our best friend, taking us along for the ride, to get us all this delicious, delightful stuff. Again, and to be able to have the delicious, delightful stuff without the attachment, how do you do that? I mean, this is what we're all in the process of learning. I haven't mastered that. And of course, in Tantra, you're about, once more, even just looking at the pleasure and trying to see the energy of the whole mind of attachment that's drawn to that without the attachment being there, so that we can use that force or that energy. It's even more complex. But if we don't do the initial work to identify it and see it as a negative that we want to get rid of, then it's impossible to engage in Tantra, much less, sutra path. So let's take our break. So it's 20 to 4. Let's meet right around 4 then, to get a little extra time. It'll probably be shortly after 4, but try to be back in here at 4. So we have at least another hour to plow through some verses. I'm going to set a goal for today.